Back when I was 24, I tried my luck at plentyoffish.com. This was maybe only months before Tinder started getting popular, and I had a way better experience with that app, but then instead of just holding off for a few months, I was so desperate that I went with the jankiest, most depressing website in history, Plenty of Fish. When I was using it, there seemed to be a lot of really sad-looking divorcees who put their last few chips on finding love online. I mean, all power to them, they deserve it, and I hope they find someone. But reading all the stories of divorce and wanting to remember what real love feels like as a 24-year-old guy, it was just uber depressing sometimes. But then, after a month or two of striking out, I get talking to this cute girl who's the same age as me, and as the days go by, we really started hitting it off. We had to wait until I was home from college in December to actually meet up, but she was great conversation, and she was so cute, so I don't mind waiting to date her. And even better, when it came to actually organizing something, she invited me over to her family's home because her mom and dad were out of town visiting relatives for the holiday. I know it might sound crude, but finding out that her folks wouldn't be there was when I figured that it would no longer be just a movie and a pizza kind of deal, and that if I played it right, I actually might eat breakfast there too, if you know what I mean. Anyway, I go over to her place for what amounted to our first date. Everything went smooth and I ended up staying overnight. Then, the next morning, I wake up earlier than she does and I'm just sort of lying there, watching her sleep. I know that sounds creepy, but she looks super cute asleep and generally reveling in that little feeling of victory you get after a date going well. The next thing I know, I hear the front door open and slam as someone enters the house downstairs, and instantly I'm rolling out of bed to get dressed because there's no way I want my first introduction to her parents to be just appearing in their house having obviously slept with their daughter. Me rolling out of bed wakes her up too, and when she hears someone downstairs, she starts freaking out and telling me to hide as we begin hearing someone walking up the stairs. I just throw on what little clothing I had in reach, then basically dived under the girl's bed and kept really, really still and quiet. Seconds later, I see the door open, and the feet of the guy I assumed was her dad walking into her room. But then the way he started talking to her was not how any dad talks to his daughter. At first, I assumed the worst, like they had some kind of really unhealthy relationship or something, especially when I heard them kiss, and it sounded a lot like it was on the lips. But then, as they carried on talking, I realized that they definitely weren't father and daughter, and that my date had some kind of weird sugar daddy relationship with this guy while living in his house. The idea of getting caught by that guy and not the girl's dad had me way, way more scared for some reason. But then when he said that he was going to go take a shower, I breathed a sigh of relief knowing that I actually had an escape route. The second the guy left the room, I scrambled out from under the bed and started putting the rest of my clothes on, whispering to the girl like, "What the actual F were you thinking putting me in danger like this?" She's just like, "Oh my god, I'm so sorry, I didn't think he'd be home so soon." She didn't even address the fact that it wasn't even her parents' place, and I was so mad about all the things she'd lied about that I didn't even bother to bring them up. After all, the priority was getting dressed and getting out of there. I figured since the guy was in the shower, I'd have at least a window of like 5 minutes to get down the stairs out the front door without him being any the wiser. But then, right as I walked out of the girl's room and onto the upstairs landing, the guy walks out of the bathroom in nothing but a towel, and we lock eyes right there and then. There's just this brief moment where all he says is, "Who are you?" And then he sort of just looks over my shoulder at the bedroom and quickly puts two and two together. I started running down the stairs before he even reacted, but I knew that he was chasing me just from the sound of him screaming right behind me. I ended up struggling with the front door for a second, just long enough for him to grab me by the shirt, but somehow I managed to pull myself out of his grip and get some more distance between us. Then I look around, and the guy is chasing me down his driveway, completely naked, with a look on his face like he was seriously about to kill me if he caught up with me. I swear to God, I've never been so terrified in my whole life. Not just of having the crap beaten out of me by a guy way bigger than me, but having the life beaten out of me by a naked dude. That was just this whole other level of fear. The next time I looked behind me, the guy was gone, and I figured that he suddenly realized that he was running through the early morning streets with no clothes on, before bailing back inside before anyone called the cops. Probably even weirder than that, though, was the fact that the girl actually wanted to see me again. It kind of dawned on me that she actually liked the idea of two guys fighting over her, and that she was just some manipulative, cheating skank. I didn't see her again. I just deleted her number and she stopped trying to contact me. But sometimes I wonder if she hooked some other guy into her little game, and that he wasn't so lucky in being able to get away. This all happened during my first year in uni. I once agreed to go out on a date with a very good-looking guy that also seemed pretty nice, so obviously I'm chuffed. He'd approached me in the city center, saying he recognized me from uni. Then he laid down loads of charm before asking me out, so I decided to see how it would go. First date, he started by being a gentleman, holding the door open for me, pulling out my chair, that sort of thing. He was actually pretty good at conversation, too. Things felt natural and chilled. We had a nice dinner, too, but then when it came to the end of the night, he started to really push into the physical, whereas I was in no hurry at all. I had to straight up tell him to back it up because I am not that type of girl. I didn't know nearly enough about him to trust him, and I honestly thought he was smart enough to respect that. But after that date, he started constantly texting me at all hours, and would get irritated to the point of threatening if I didn't message him back. The last straw was when he called me 12 times in the middle of the night, each call coming one after the other. There were a bunch of weird messages like, "Why aren't you answering when I need you?" And I just couldn't take any more from him. I was very straight and curt. I told him he needed to back off and chill out, but his response was to tell me that he was in love with me. I felt these intense, twin feelings of cringe and dread. Cringe because of how obviously cringe it was to say that so early, then dread because I realized getting rid of this guy would be a total ordeal. I texted back something like, "I have no idea how you can think that because you've barely gotten to know me and I hardly know you." He then followed up with this barrage of texts that continued long into the night, and each one somehow got more and more creepier as the night went on. I remember he'd always send 2 messages, real quick, one after the other, and one pair was like, in all capitals, "Why aren't you answering? I thought you were the one, and you can't even text or call? That's messed up." Then he'd follow up with, "Don't make me come find you." He mostly kept to that same pattern for the whole time that he was texting me that night. One text would frighten the life out of me, then the other would read like he was trying to convince me that it was all my fault, or that I shouldn't be so scared of him even though he just said something incredibly scary. I wish that I had been somewhere other than my uni dorm, which was away from where all my friends from lecture were staying because there was no one there to stop me reading his messages. I know I should have stopped for the sake of my own sanity, but at the same time, I just couldn't stop reading them. I remember wanting to know if he had actually found me, or had said anything like, "I'm on my way to you," and I wanted to know if I really needed to worry about my safety, so I just kept on soaking up all this horrible words and threats until I just turned my phone off and cried myself to sleep. The next morning, I demanded that he delete my number and stop contacting me because he was scaring me. He responded by trying to call me roughly 30 times throughout the day. Then when he realized that I wasn't going to answer, he texted another night until I turned my phone off. One morning, I had to be up for 6 for work, and I must have forgotten to put my phone on Do Not Disturb because it just started screeching my ringtone on the bedside table, waking me up in the process. When I saw that it was his name on the screen, I just lost it. I actually answered the call, then proceeded to give him what for. I told him that his behavior was disturbing, and that I truly thought that he needed help, and that I really didn't know him enough to be at the receiving end of this, how I just didn't bloody deserve it. I think he was just in shock that I answered the call in the first place because He just broke into apologies and started telling me how sorry he was that he'd been so immature. I could barely get a word out as he told me how if I gave him another chance, I'd be glad that I did, and that we were so right for each other and he was just overwhelmed by it all. I thought I was rid of him, but to hear how he was just so completely deluded and over-emotional about a first date was as scary as it was depressing. I just went with the nuclear option. I told him I didn't want to see him again, and that if he contacted me again with any threatening messages, I'd be going straight to the police. He didn't even respond when I told him that. He just went all quiet, either out of sadness or out of rage. Then after a few seconds of silence, I just hung up. The next month or so was pretty blissful. I didn't hear from him at all, and the whole incident went from being a fresh wound to something I joke about with friends. Then suddenly he starts writing me on Facebook, commenting on all my pictures and posting all kinds of stuff on my wall. I had naively lowered all my privacy settings so that people I met at uni could contact me easier, as I was still a first year and I wanted to network. Big mistake on my part, and as much as I blocked and reported him as quick as I could, in my mind, the damage was already done, as some of the people I'd met over the year now thought that I had some weird obsessive boyfriend. After that, he started sending me emails that said things like, "I can't stop thinking about you. Sometimes I see you around and it kills me that I screwed up my chances with you. You're such a decent person, but it's pretty messed up how you handled things." I didn't reply. I just made sure to block all his social media and email addresses as I figured showing him any attention at all would just make things worse. It definitely seemed to work for a while, as his attempts at communication dropped off completely, but then things escalated in a way that was even creepier than his attempts to talk to me online. So during the last few months of my first year, I managed to get myself a part-time job at a little cafe in the town center. Then, towards the end of one shift, my colleague started talking about some guy who had been sitting across the road from the cafe on some steps and how he'd been there for hours. I got this sinking feeling right away and asked one of them what the guy looked like, and they pretty much described my stalker to a T. When I went to make sure that it was him, basically praying that it was just some kind of coincidence, my stomach dropped when I saw him sitting there, staring at the front windows of the cafe. We made brief eye contact for a second, then I went straight into the back of the house to tell the manager what was going on. She was brilliant about the whole thing, and told me to stay in the little manager's office to phone the police while she went out to tell the guy that the police were on their way, and he shouldn't be hanging around outside a girl's workplace waiting for her to leave. Over the next week or so, I was in touch with a police officer who asked me to share all records of times the guy had communicated with me, especially all the threatening messages he'd sent me. Luckily, I'd had the presence of mind to screenshot the more violent and threatening messages just in case I had to actually go to the police. I didn't want it to be an empty threat. I wanted to be able to really show the guy that I meant business so the police could show up at his place or give him a call to let him know that they knew what he was up to. And that's exactly what they did. They gave him a call to check his thinking, as the one officer put it. Then after that, he didn't attempt to contact me again. That incident of stalking at the cafe was the last interaction I had with the guy, but it wasn't the last I heard of him. A whole year later, I was talking with a girl in the smoking area of a pub I was drinking at, and the conversation got on to student dating. She started telling me how she'd gone on one date with a guy that she thought was really handsome and charming, and he turned out to be a complete nightmare. I asked her how he was a nightmare, and she basically described the exact same behavior I'd been subjected to the year before. I asked her if the guy was named Liam, and her jaw dropped before saying, "Yes, how did you know?" I then spilled my guts on how the exact same thing happened to me, then basically told her to do all the same things I did, screenshot messages, forward them to the police, and most importantly, do not engage. She seemed really, really grateful to be talking to someone who knew what she was going through, and we kept in touch to make sure Liam left her alone too. We're still good friends actually, even all these years later, and although we're not in the same city anymore, we still keep in touch to provide a bit of dating support network, so to speak. Thankfully, nothing like that has ever happened to me since, but at least I know that if it does, I'm actually equipped to deal with it in a way that I just wasn't when I was younger. Back in 2017, I was a 29-year-old guy working as the head of social media for a large supermarket chain here in the UK. I had job security at a big, semi-recession-proof company, a great retirement plan, and plenty of opportunities to advance further up the marketing team. There was just one big problem. I hated it. I hated how my entire life revolved around Twitter and Instagram. I hated the stale, corporate lifestyle and all the cheesy, pretentious management and marketing lingo. I hated the cretins that would somehow take issue with all of my team's posts, and I hated having to glad hand with executives who clearly resented having to deal with me. I also felt like I just hadn't enjoyed my 20s enough, having spent more time climbing the corporate ladder than doing all the traveling and partying that brought my peers so much happiness. So one day, I just quit. My colleagues were stunned when I handed my notice in, although one or two were definitely hiding smiles since my old position would be up for grabs. I didn't care though, as one more year in that job would have driven me absolutely mental, and I had enough money saved up that I could spend a bit of time just drifting and trying to find my passion. I didn't really have a plan for my future, only my near future, and that consisted of a whole lot of traveling. The only question was, where to? Given that I'd earned a B in GCSE Spanish, Central and South America was always on the cards. But after doing a little bit of research on the different countries I could visit, I decided on Colombia. Before you assume, no, my choice had nothing to do with a particular marching powder that the country seems to be famous for, although I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a fan of the show Narcos. It was more of a case of Colombians having a huge passion for football, as well as it being one of the cheaper South American countries. Then, when I heard that they could be very welcoming to tourists, my mind was made up. I paid 3 months' rent in advance, did a big shop for all things I'd need for travel, big rucksack, hot weather clothing, etc., then started shopping for cheap flights almost right away. Then, once everything was booked, including some initial accommodation, I took a cab to the airport and caught my flight to Colombia. My first stop was Bogota, the capital city, and as incredible a place as it was, with amazing people and amazing food, Bogota isn't where my story occurs. I spent 3 weeks there, and over the course of those 3 weeks, I spent most evenings in this little bar around the corner from my hotel. That's where I got talking to this guy called Luis, who was an overall top geezer and introduced me to a lot of Colombian slang and culture. He also gave me a few tips on places that I could travel to next, and one of those places was Cali, near Colombia's southern coast. The first reason I liked the sound of Cali was because Luis said it was much safer than Bogota or Medellin, which made it great for tourists. They had 2 football teams whose games I could catch for tickets that costed a fraction of what they did back home, and there was a massive salsa festival on for a week, which Luis assured me would be a good laugh, even for someone like me who had 2 left feet. I definitely wasn't into salsa dancing, but I did think the music was cool, and at that point, it was all about experiences for me. And a few days before the festival, I packed my bags and jumped on a plane for the 1-hour flight to Cali. Cali was a lot smaller than Bogota, still big, just not so overwhelming, so it felt a lot less intense and much more homely after a few days of living there. And then, the festival started. And it was suddenly just as busy as Bogota because people from all over the country flocked to Cali for the annual salsa festival. Like I said, I definitely wasn't into dancing at the time, but after watching so much of it, I suddenly found myself very jealous of some of the blokes. Because oh my god, some of the girl dancers were just stunningly beautiful. They were also everywhere, packing out almost every nightclub and bar. Anywhere salsa was playing, these girls were looking for someone to dance with. I think the last time I danced before my trip to Colombia was the Macarena back in primary school. Then in the middle of this festival, I suddenly found myself wanting to learn how. And that's how I ended up sitting in a nightclub, nursing a few beers and hoping I could find a girl who would teach me to dance. It took a few nights of hanging around and getting shot down, but eventually, I ended up making eye contact with a girl from across the bar. It was one of those you make eye contact, then you look away and blush kind of things, and since her table was all girls, I just knew I had a shot with her. So the next time she approached the bar to get a drink, I sidled up to her and my best Spanish asked her, "Can I buy you a drink?" She said yes. We got to talking, and before I knew it, I'd forgotten all about the salsa lessons and was solely interested in her. She said her name was Maria Eugenia. I'll never forget that. She gave me 2 first names and said that she was a student at one of the local universities. We talked about this and that over a drink for hours before one of her friends popped over to tell her that they were leaving. I tried my luck and told her that she was welcome to stay in my hotel room, but she just laughed and told me that Colombian girls just don't do things that way. If I wanted to see her again, it'd have to be an actual date where I took her somewhere nice and not just for more beers. It was a deal. I promised to take her somewhere fancy, and she gave me her phone number and asked me to WhatsApp her. A few days later, we met up in a very fancy little cafe for more conversation. She was even more beautiful than I remembered, and her English turned out to be so good that we kept swapping back and forth and sometimes leaning on her English more than my mediocre by comparison Spanish. Maria was just amazing, and I was just over the moon that she was showing any interest in me at all. I'm quite a streetwise person too, I'd like to think so anyway, and nothing about her behavior was remotely suspicious to me at the time. So, after we grabbed some coffee, we got some food, then ended up going for more beers at a quieter place than the night before. We stayed all night. Then when the bar kicked out, we bought a few bottles of beer and decided to walk back to Maria's hotel. Only 2 things. She bought the beers and walked out with them already open, and I'm not sure the place we walked to was her hotel. That's the last thing I remember of that night. Walking through the warm, humid night and chatting away with this gorgeous Colombian girl. After that, nothing. I don't remember saying goodnight to Maria. I don't remember walking back to my hotel, and I certainly don't remember everything else that I got up to that night. I had to piece it together the next day, and believe me, the pieces weren't pretty. I woke up in a bed, my bed sheets covered in vomit, with the worst headache I've ever had in my life. I didn't fancy going back to sleep next to my own sick, but then the moment I sat up in bed, another wave of nausea hit me, and I closed my eyes and lied back down to keep from puking again, even though it felt like I had nothing left in my stomach. I've had some bad hangovers in my time, but nothing like that. Yet, I've never actually been blackout drunk before, so I just assumed that that's what was happening when in reality, it was way worse. I had absolutely no recollection of wandering through Cali and somehow stumbling into more alcohol, and strong stuff too by the feel of it. But I must have. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been feeling like death, right? The first thing I do when I finally managed to roll out of bed was start looking for my phone. I think it was just instinctual at first, but then as I was looking for it, I realized that I could check for any calls, texts, or pictures that I made during the night, which might help me fill out my patchy memory. The only thing was, I couldn't find my phone. I checked the whole hotel room before realizing that my wallet was missing too, but that wasn't quite as bad as my phone because I got into the habit of just taking cash whenever I left the hotel and leaving my debit card tucked into my passport, kind of like an insurance policy for if I got robbed or something. So, I get dressed, then go into my luggage to get my debit card just in case I needed to pick up a new phone that day. I then leave the hotel with the initial plan of heading over to where Maria was staying, naively thinking she might be able to help me piece together the previous night so I could maybe retrieve my lost phone and wallet. Only once I got to her hotel, and the manager told me that no one fitting Maria's description was staying there, did the penny actually drop. She got me blackout drunk, then stole my phone and wallet. Obviously, I didn't want to believe it was true. I wanted to believe that this stunning Colombian girl wanted to date me, and it was all just some horrible misunderstanding. But slowly but surely, it started sinking in that something really dodgy had happened. But even as I was walking to the nearest ATM, when I actually accepted that I might have actually just gotten scammed, I had no idea how bad the damage really was. I'm feeling pretty low by the time I find myself at the ATM, sliding my card in and selecting the 50,000 pesos button. 50,000 Colombian pesos was just less than a tenner at the time, and it was supposed to be a bit of hand cash so I could pick up a new wallet, get a bite to eat, that sort of thing. But then the ATM started telling me insufficient funds over and over. I knew I had way more than a tenner in that account, which foolishly was my only bank account at the time, so I honestly just thought the ATM might have been broken. But then, just before I walked off to find a new one, I instinctively got a bit panicky and decided to actually check my bank balance to make sure all my money was actually still there. My balance should have been around 80 million pesos, which was roughly 20,000 pounds, and I remember how I started to feel sick again when the balance came back as just over 4,000 pesos. 4,000 pesos is nothing. It was just over a pound back then, and as I stood there, staring at this nauseatingly low number, I once again entered a complete state of denial. There was no way I could have lost 20 grand literally overnight. I just refused to believe it. The next ATM said I only had 4,000 pesos. Then the next machine said the same thing. And it finally took a third ATM before it really hit me that I'd lost way more than my phone and my wallet that night. Since I had no phone to call my bank, the first thing I did was go to the nearest police station to tell some officers what had happened. My Spanish isn't fluent by any stretch, but I knew enough to make myself understood and to understand what the officers were telling me. And once I told them everything that happened, from start to finish, one of them just looked at the other and said, "Scopolamina." I had no idea what scopolamine was at the time. I didn't even know it was a drug or what effects it had, so the cops had to tell me exactly what it was and how someone had used it to drain my bank account. Basically, scopolamine turns an awake and responsive person into a sleepwalker. Some people have used the word zombie to describe those under the drug's effects, but from what I understand, that's a pretty inaccurate way of explaining it. People affected by scopolamine seem mildly intoxicated at best, to the point that you'd have no idea that they were under the drug's effects unless you actually tested them for it. What the cops think happened is this. When Maria went inside the shop to grab some beers for us, either her or someone she was working with put the drug in my beer. Then, by the time we were at the place that she said was her hotel, I was just gone. After that, I must have been in such a trance that I just gave them all my bank details and only later found out that they'd taken me to a load of different shops and ATMs to siphon off all the money. The police knew exactly what happened to me and were very familiar with tourists being robbed while under the influence of scopolamine, but they could do absolutely nothing to help me. Apparently, prosecuting someone for that kind of crime is very, very difficult, and unless I could bring them a list of places that had siphoned off my money, there was just nothing they could do. My bank was also disgustingly unhelpful when I was finally able to get in touch with them, saying that I'd passed several fraud checks by giving all my details when the fraud department called my phone. I tried explaining that I was under the effects of scopolamine, and although they too seemed familiar with fraud cases involving the drug, they explained that it was a criminal matter and that filing for compensation would be a long and arduous process. I did eventually get a list of the places I'd been robbed, and I was in touch with a Colombian lawyer for a while about criminal charges, but that all fell through after a while when he contacted me to tell me that the police weren't likely to put a case together. The only luck I had was with my bank, who ended up offering me a few £1,000s in compensation, but I did have to basically threaten them with legal action unless they paid the compensation usually entitled to people who are robbed under duress. I couldn't get victims of crime compensation from the British government either, as it was something that happened overseas, but honestly, I still count my blessings. As I'm sure you can all imagine, scopolamine is a very powerful drug, but people who get spiked with the drug before getting robbed, they're considered the lucky ones. Those that drug people and rob people with it barely know the exact doses to give people, and deaths from overdoses are shockingly common. Many a tourist has been found dead in their hotel room from scopolamine overdoses, and so the fact that I even got to walk away with my life makes me feel very, very blessed sometimes. I ended up leaving South America early, as after getting in touch with my parents via the police station, they sent me enough money to get a plane ticket home as soon as possible. It was a really dark time for me after that, and I felt stupid and depressed for a long, long time. The only thing that actually got me over losing the amount of money was the fact that I could have died, and I just weighed up 20 grand against the end of my life, and suddenly things didn't seem so terrible anymore. I was one of the lucky ones, one of the people who got to leave Colombia with just a bruised ego and an empty bank account, because there are many people who went to sleep after having their bank accounts drained and never woke up. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. This happened back when I'd been out of the dating game for about a year or so, and being a painfully awkward person who doesn't really get out much, my best friend had convinced me to try online dating. I thought it was a good idea at the time, so I ended up signing up to that OkCupid website. I could just chat with people for a while, get to know them, then I could work out who was creepy and who was not, then just hit up whoever was the best match. So I meet this guy on the site and we spend a few weeks chatting and getting to know each other. He actually seemed really cool and chill, kind of quirky, but not nearly as red flag waving weird as some of the other guys I'd talked to. When the time was just right, he asked me on a date, and by that point I was quite excited about meeting him, so I said, sure, why not? I told the guy that I preferred simple, low-profile dates, so he suggested that I go over to his place so he could make us some dinner, and after that we could watch some indie horror films, which was something we were both into. I told my friend about this, the same one who suggested online dating, and we discussed some of the risks of just going over to his place instead of meeting in a public place first. I get that it's a real roll of the dice doing that kind of thing, but there was the minor detail of me being 6'2" and him being 5'7". I know that's hardly a major height difference, and it didn't bother me that he was shorter, especially when it meant that he probably wouldn't be able to straight up overpower me if anything went wrong with the date. Plus, I gotta admit to being a real sucker for a guy that can cook, so that definitely clouded my judgment in many respects. That being said, when I showed up to his place, me and my friend had developed a code word system that we could use through text or calls, and she had all the details of where I was. So, if I got there and things just didn't feel right, I could call her or text her, drop the emergency code word, and she'd think of a reason for me to leave and then come pick me up. Anyway, as I said, I arrived and we got up to his apartment so he can show me around. He started emphasizing his bedroom a little too much, commented on how his big bed would fit me, but I just put that down to some awkward bad taste jokes and got him to move on. After that, he then takes me to the kitchen, where I assumed that he was about to try and claw some points back by actually cooking me dinner. He talked about what a good cook he was and how he was going to wow me with his cooking skills, but when it came to it, he hadn't actually bought anything to cook at all. All he bought for our date was this bottle of red wine, and he claimed that it was super expensive, I guess. I made the mistake of showing up on an empty stomach, thinking that he was actually going to cook for me, so when I found out that I wasn't about to be fed, I was very disappointed, and actually kind of angry too. But then, instead of understanding why I'd been so annoyed, the guy kept emphasizing the bottle, telling me how he'd spent like $100-something on it, and that I should be more grateful that I actually dug deep into his pockets to buy us something like that. Don't get me wrong, I like wine, but I don't know wine. So to me, that thing could have been the rarest bottle in existence or the cheapest crap from the crummiest liquor store, and I've never have known it. So instead of having dinner, we ended up talking over this bottle of wine, which I'll admit was pretty good, but not something I'd ever pay hundreds for. The first actual red flag I noticed was when it became blatantly obvious that he was trying to get me wasted. There came a point where if I took so much as a sip from my drink, he'd be all like, "Want a top off?" and pour even more wine into my glass. That combined with the not making any kind of dinner at all, and I started to get very uncomfortable. I still figured that he was just trying to be romantic or whatever, and that he was just dumb as opposed to malicious or predatory. So, after pretty much forcing him to let me eat the remains of a bag of chips and some toast, I felt together enough to just carry on with the date and see where things went. I mean, he was also drinking pretty heavily, and I always figured those kind of guys would pretend to drink or something just to make their date drink more. But he was chugging that wine down like a trooper, so I just slowed my sips until all the wine was gone, then we headed to the couch for some movies. Anyway, we sit on the couch and I ask what movie he'd pick for us to watch. He'd already picked something out and was keeping it a surprise until I got there and had teased me with a selection all day like, "You're gonna love this movie. It's so hardcore, so underrated," stuff like that. Gotta admit too, I was actually pretty stoked to find out what he'd picked, as I knew that he had good taste and we shared a lot of favorite indie horror movies. But then instead of some hidden gem I'd never heard of, something I could actually take an interest in, something that might salvage what had been a pretty crappy date so far, he pulls out a Serbian film. Now, for those that don't know, a Serbian film basically bills itself as the most graphically gruesome and disturbing movie of all time. I know some people are really into it and can talk for days about all the metaphors, hidden meanings, and theories surrounding it. But me personally, I hate it. It's just an increasingly violent but meaningless mix of gore and adult movies that has zero value past shock. So when he suggested we put it on, I very politely asked if he had anything else in mind because I'd already seen a Serbian film and I wasn't all that excited about watching it again, obviously. But nope, he insists we watch it, picking up on the fact that I wasn't into it and then trying to tell me that the only reason I didn't like it was because I didn't understand it. I pretty much decided there and then that this guy wasn't getting a second date, and as much as I was mad at how patronizing he was, I just kept my cool and got my phone out to text my friend our emergency code word so she could end the date. As soon as I got my phone out and started typing, the guy is vocally irritated when he says, "Who you texting?" His tone and attitude once again affirmed why he wouldn't be getting a second shot at this, but again I just kept my cool and replied, "Just letting a friend know I'll be home late tonight." This is something me and my friend had already planned out, and it worked like a charm. The guy totally thought that he was in the clear and calmed back down again on the assumption that I was going to give him some or whatever. Then a few minutes later, my girl comes through with the call and puts on an Oscar-winning performance that there had been a break-in at our apartment. We live separately. The call volume was loud enough that the guy could hear, and all I had to do was act naturally and sell the bit. My friend then asks if I need a ride from somewhere, and I tell her this guy's whole address, down to the zip code, just to subtly let him know that someone knew where I was. I thought I was going to be out of there in maybe 10 to 15 minutes, but then my friend tells me how she had to drive her little sister somewhere and that she was 40-something minutes away. I was livid. It turned out that she had to run an errand for her mom whose car was in the shop, so I guess it was just bad luck more than her not sticking to the plan. But still, I was pretty horrified to think that I'd have to sit through 40 more minutes of such a gross film with a guy that had gotten way weirder and creepier as he gotten drunker. For the next 30 minutes, I had to sit through the guy giving me this whole thesis on why a Serbian film is the best indie horror movie since the Blair Witch Project, and that the reason it's so horrible is because it's a mirror which reflects a decaying society or some nonsense. As the minutes tick by, increasingly weird and gruesome things are happening. But basically, there comes a point when something super gross is happening and a kid is involved, I'll just say that. I don't want to tell you exactly what happens in the movie, less because of spoilers and more because it's so disgusting that I don't want to type it out. But it gets to this really bad part of the movie, and the guy next to me starts breathing super heavy and loud through his nostrils. He'd also insisted on turning the lights off, by the way, which admittedly I did agree to. But then picture the sound of heavy breathing right next to you in a dark room, and you understand how creeped out I was. I gave my head the tiniest little turn, straining my eyes to see what he was doing, and saw him just staring at the screen. First time he'd been quiet for pretty much the whole movie. I then actually turned to face him to say, "You good, dude?" And after giving me this weird little groan of, huh? actually scoops up the couch a little to be closer to me, like so close our hips are touching. I tell him, "Whoa there, buddy, way too early for that move." But he just sort of whines again and replies, "Why not?" Thankfully, it really was coming close to pickup time, so I could use that as an excuse as to why we couldn't start doing anything. But then he saw it the exact opposite way. Because I was leaving soon, he felt all entitled to getting a little something. Two waves of grossness hit me, one after the other. The first was how poorly he timed his little move on me, coupled with the actual physical contact. Both made my skin crawl, but the second wave of grossness hit me way harder because that's when I considered what had actually prompted his little finesse attempt. He'd been staring super intently into some of the grossest, most obscene stuff I'd ever seen on film, and that's what had him wanting to make out. I cannot overstate how completely creeped out I was. I remember recoiling a little, but then he tried to put his hand on my thigh, and then that was it. I was out of there. I didn't care if I had to wait in the street outside. I was not spending another minute in this creepy, handsy guy's dark apartment. I grabbed my purse, stood up, then told him, "I'm sorry, I have to go." After that, I just marched towards the apartment front door and hoped that he wouldn't try and make a scene in the hallway. He didn't actually follow me outside, which I'm grateful for, honestly. But somehow what he did was way, way worse in terms of how terrifying it was. Picture me walking down the apartment's hallway, almost total darkness, praying that he wasn't about to run up behind me to kill me. And then all I hear in the dark is this screech, and I mean screech of, "You're not leaving!" I just zoomed for the door, somehow got it open after panicking that the guy had locked it somehow, then bolted downstairs and out of the apartment building. I kept thinking that he'd follow me with a frickin' knife or a baseball bat or something, and although he didn't, that fear was constantly with me as I power walked up the street, looking over my shoulder every few seconds to make sure that I was still alone. I then gave my friend a call and told her to hurry up, and thankfully she was only a minute or two away, so I was out of the neighborhood and finally safe from the guy, or at least in my mind I was safe from him since I didn't know his neighborhood very well. The whole car ride back, I was telling my friend how a weak start to the date had just descended into this total nightmare, and the whole time she's cringing so hard, until I got to the part about that scene of the movie and how he'd reacted to it. And that's when she started getting scared for me, laying on apologies about taking so long to get to me. Obviously, I forgave her. It wasn't her fault that her mom had a car emergency, but I was still pretty shaken up after having to wait there for so long. I ended up blocking the guy's number before he could try to get in touch with me again, but after a few days of the incident being on my mind, I decided it wasn't enough to just cut him out of my life. He might not have hurt me that night. He might not even try to, but something told me that it was just a matter of time before that guy did something that couldn't be fixed by just a pint of gelato and some girl talk. I know it's not illegal to go on a bad date with anyone, and I know this might make me sound like a total Karen in many ways, but I ended up calling the cops just to tell them what had happened. They agreed that it wasn't illegal to be bad at dating, and I knew trying to pursue assault over his thigh touch thing would just be pointless. But the cops were cool in that they said that they keep his name on file just in case anything came up in the future, and they actually thanked me for letting them know, too. That made me feel like I might have actually done something to prevent anything really bad from happening in the future, and part of me hopes the cops went over to warn him, but maybe that's just wishful thinking on my part. What I do know is how that experience totally warned me off of online dating for a few years, and it wasn't until Bumble came out that I actually started dipping my toes back into the water. I know, I wasn't hurt, and I can say that in a world where so many young women's lives are snatched away by violent men, what happened that night still terrified me, and I'd never have guessed that the guy was like that from our few weeks of talking online. But the number one thing I learned from it, always meet in a public place that you know well for a first date, and always have an escape plan. I ended up going back to this guy's apartment after what had admittedly been a great first date. But when I got there, it turned out that he lived like an absolute savage. Just to be clear, I wasn't actually planning on giving him anything. I was just really vibing with him and didn't quite want the conversation to end so early. His kitchen smelled like death. His bathroom was disgusting, and I swear to God, I spotted some kind of brown-red stain on his pillowcase as I walked past his bedroom. I was on the verge of just ghosting right then and there, but I figured no one's perfect, and his cleanliness was something that we could just work on if we ended up being a couple. But then, he mentioned something about having a kid he never saw, and when I asked why he didn't get to see them, if his ex was a psycho or something, he just said something like, "Nah, I have no interest in being a dad at this stage in my life." I really didn't like that answer, so I pretty much just ended the date minutes later by telling him that I was tired and had to be up early the next morning. He obviously didn't take that very well, as I think it was kind of obvious that I just decided that I wasn't into him based on his attitude towards his ex and how he kept his apartment. But still, he lets me leave and I head down to my car to drive back home. Then, as I'm backing out of his apartment's parking lot, I see something rushing towards my car out of the corner of my eye. It was the guy that I'd been on a date with, and for a second, I figured that I might have left something behind in his apartment, so I stopped the car and waited for him to knock on the driver's side window or whatever. Instead, he walks around in front of the car and just slams a fist into the windshield so hard that he cracks it. I swear that he must have broken his knuckles or something from the impact, but I didn't stick around to find out. I just backed up and gunned it towards the parking lot exit as he ran after my car. I was instantly shaking so hard that I had to pull over after a few minutes of driving, and I called my mom to tell her what had happened. She ended up taking an Uber to where I was parked so she could drive me back to my apartment, as I was honestly worried that I might cause an accident or something. It was definitely the single worst date I'd ever been on, and it was really weird because it started out so well. I guess you just can't tell a lot about a person until you actually see how they live. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.